I started hiking just before dawn on a chilly early spring morning in Shenandoah National Park. The trailhead was nearly empty, a few cars in the small parking area already coated in morning dew, their windows fogged from the overnight cold. The air was damp and heavy, carrying the scent of wet leaves and pine needles. The fog was thick, settling low over the ground and threading through the trees, making the familiar path feel alien. I could barely see 20 feet ahead, and the trees around me were blurred into gray shapes, their dark trunks rising out of the mist like shadows frozen in place. The ground was soft and damp under my boots, leaves and twigs muffling my steps. The rhythm of my breathing, the slap of my shoes against the dirt, and the occasional bird call were the only sounds I could hear. It felt isolated in a way that was exhilarating at first, a rare solitude in a park that is usually crowded on weekends. As I walked, I tried to keep my mind on the rhythm of the trail, the way the roots twisted across the path, and the way the fog clung to the low branches. The fog made everything look muted. The greens of the moss and undergrowth faded into gray, and even the blue of the sky was hidden behind a thick white ceiling. I had hiked this trail before in clear weather, but the fog made it feel like a completely different place. Every turn revealed nothing but more gray mist, more twisted roots, and more dark tree trunks. About 30 minutes in, I began to notice a sound I couldn't immediately place. At first, I thought it was my imagination, the snap of a small branch, the crunch of leaves, but then it became clearer. Footsteps. Someone was walking behind me, and they were matching my pace. At first, I froze, my chest tightening as I tried to convince myself it could be another hiker, maybe a jogger who had started early. The trail was narrow, winding through dense trees, and I hadn't seen another person for miles. I stopped completely, trying to hear over the pounding of my own heart. The footsteps stopped too. My stomach tightened, a sudden chill running through me, not from the cold but from the awareness of another presence. After a moment, I forced myself to keep moving, picking up the pace slightly. Almost immediately, the footsteps resumed, deliberate and steady, echoing softly through the fog. They weren't light, casual steps. They had weight, like someone was trying to keep exactly the same distance behind me, measuring it. My first instinct was to run, but I knew the trail was tricky, full of roots and uneven dirt. Running blindly could be worse. I kept walking faster, my eyes darting through the fog, trying to make out any shape, any movement. That's when I saw it, just a few feet away through the gray haze. A dark figure, standing slightly hunched, almost blending with the shadows of the trees. It didn't make a sound, didn't move toward me, but there was an intensity to the way it waited, as if it was gauging me, waiting for me to make a mistake. I stopped again and ducked behind a tree, pressing my back against the wet bark and holding my breath. My palms were slick with sweat despite the cold, and I could hear the shallow rush of my own breathing, loud in the fog. The figure didn't advance. It just remained there, moving slightly, shifting weight from one foot to the other, deliberately. I couldn't tell anything about it. The fog blurred details, and the way it blended with the trees made it impossible to tell if it was a man or a woman, tall or short, young or old. All I knew was that it was there, and it was aware of me. I waited, counting seconds that felt like minutes, until I convinced myself that staying put was more dangerous than moving. I edged along the side of the trail, trying to make my presence seem accidental, hoping it wouldn't notice me slipping away. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but the figure didn't follow immediately. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure it would echo through the mist and give away my position. Every step felt deliberate, careful, the wet leaves and mud making soft squelches underfoot, but somehow my mind imagined it louder, echoing through the silence. After what felt like an eternity, I decided to move faster, jogging lightly where the roots allowed, bending low to keep the fog in my favor. The figure was gone. I couldn't see it through the gray wall, and I didn't hear footsteps matching mine anymore. My chest heaved as I tried to regulate my breathing, but I didn't stop until I reached a small clearing, the kind where the trail leveled out and widened slightly. In the distance, I could see the faint outline of the ranger checkpoint, a small wooden cabin with a weathered sign, the first signs of civilization I had come across in the mist. The figure was nowhere in sight. I made my way to the checkpoint as quickly as I could, boots squelching in the mud, eyes darting through the fog, but there was nothing. No sound, no movement, just the trees and the gray haze. When I reached the cabin, the sense of relief that washed over me was almost physical. The warmth from the small propane heater inside, the smell of cleaning supplies and old wood, made the foggy, damp forest outside feel like another world. The rangers at the desk were friendly, though distracted, and when I tried to explain what I thought I had seen, they dismissed it as probably another hiker. They said the early morning fog made it easy to misjudge distances and figures, and that people often thought they were being followed when the trail was empty. I nodded, trying to convince them, trying to convince myself, that it had been a trick of the mist and the mind. But even as I drank the lukewarm coffee they offered, my stomach twisted with the memory. I knew the trail had been empty for miles, and the way the footsteps had mirrored mine, the deliberate stillness of the figure, the way it waited without approaching. It wasn't just a misperception. I couldn't explain it rationally, but I also couldn't shake the memory of being watched, of having my movements studied in a way that felt personal. The forest outside seemed quiet, almost too quiet, and I realized I had been on that trail alone, with only the fog as a companion, until I reached that clearing. The sense of relief I felt when I saw the checkpoint was tinged with lingering tension. The knowledge that the figure could have been anything from another hiker to someone with intentions I didn't want to imagine. I stayed at the ranger station for another hour, letting the fog burn off in the rising sun, letting the warmth of the building settle into my stiff legs and tight shoulders. I watched the trail through the window, half expecting to see a shadow appear in the mist, but nothing came. When I finally left, the morning sun had begun to break through, illuminating the wet leaves and glistening branches. The park, so intimidating and otherworldly in the fog, returned to a place of ordinary beauty. Deer grazing in the distance, birds calling from the trees, the gentle curve of the trail winding through the forest. I finished the hike without incident, the memory of the figure lingering but fading with the daylight. My steps were lighter, my heart more settled, though the tightness never completely went away. Even weeks later, I would think about that morning whenever I hiked alone, remembering the deliberate steps, the silent waiting, the way the fog had twisted the familiar trail into something unrecognizable. I never saw the figure again, and I have no way of knowing who or what it was. It was just a person somewhere out there, moving through the fog in a way that left me feeling watched and vulnerable. The memory is clear, precise, and entirely real, and it has stayed with me every time I lace up my boots and step into the quiet woods. The park is the same, the trail's unchanged, but my own awareness has shifted. I have learned to trust the sounds of the forest, to watch the patterns of the fog, and to accept that there are always unknowns, even in the daylight, even on a trail I thought I knew completely. The morning in the fog taught me that isolation can magnify everything, the ordinary and the threatening alike, and that sometimes the scariest moments are the ones where nothing actually happens, but everything feels poised, deliberate, and just out of reach. I had started the hike in Devil's Glen in the late afternoon, thinking I'd have plenty of time to get back to my car before dark. It was early October, and the woods were alive with the muted colors of fall, maples and oaks streaked with orange and red, birches already pale and bare in some spots. I like hiking alone. It gives me a sense of control, a rhythm that feels mine. My pack was light, just water, some granola bars, and a headlamp I didn't really expect to use until the sun disappeared completely. The trail was quiet, as most small trails are, but familiar enough that I thought I could handle it. I'd been here once before, years ago, and had a vague sense of the area. By the time the sun dipped behind the hills, the forest floor darkened quickly. Shadows stretched long across the leaf litter, the air cooled sharply, and my breathing started to echo more than usual. I clicked on my headlamp. The beam was dim, the batteries fading faster than I expected. I told myself it was fine, that I'd just move a bit slower, take the main trail back. Then somewhere along the ridge, I remembered a shortcut I had read about online, a small side path that cut straight down to the logging road near my car. I convinced myself it would save 10 minutes, maybe more. The entrance to the shortcut was narrow and overgrown, but I pushed through, brushing branches aside. The ground dropped steeply, and my footing was uneven, packed leaves hiding roots and rocks. At first, it felt adventurous. I could see the faint outline of the trail ahead under my flickering headlamp. Then the path just ended. The forest floor opened into a tangle of underbrush, fallen logs, and thick saplings. I could see nothing resembling a trail, nothing I could follow with any confidence. My stomach sank. I paused, trying to gather my bearings. The woods were quiet in a way that felt wrong. Normally, even at night, you hear something. The wind through the trees, the distant croak of frogs, the rustle of small animals. Tonight there was nothing, just an almost suffocating stillness that pressed down on my chest. I took a deep breath, told myself to calm down, and tried to backtrack. My headlamp caught movement, shadows flitting between trees, too quick, too deliberate to be deer or raccoons. I froze, straining my ears, and then I heard it, a low, guttural grunt from somewhere behind me. My heart slammed against my ribs. A twig snapped. Slow, deliberate, right behind me. I didn't stop to look. I started running, stumbling over hidden roots, slipping in the damp leaves, using my hands to push aside low branches. My headlamp swung wildly, casting jittering beams that only made the shadows dance more. Every time I took a step, the forest seemed to respond, shadows shifting, leaves rustling in a pattern that felt purposeful. My chest burned, my legs screamed, but I couldn't stop. I didn't know what I was running toward, only that I had to get somewhere familiar. After what felt like an eternity, I burst back onto a small section of trail I recognized. Relief hit me, sudden and disorienting. I slowed down, trying to catch my breath. The trail was empty. I squinted into the dark, looking for the spot where I had left my car. Nothing. The clearing where I had parked was empty. No car. No headlights. Just trees pressing in from all sides. My stomach twisted. I moved closer to the spot, my headlamp shaking. Then I noticed the footprints in the mud. They were human, enormous, easily a size I'd never seen, and they circled the clearing. My stomach turned. I crouched, trying to make sense of it. They weren't just from someone walking past. The prints made slow loops around the car's former location, as if someone, or something, had been watching. My mind raced. I told myself I had to get out. I couldn't stay here. I ran again, not caring about the trail, the roots, the branches. I ran until my lungs were on fire, and my legs felt like lead. The forest seemed endless, oppressive, every step echoing with imagined sounds of movement just beyond the reach of my light. I tried to force myself to think rationally, to find the logging road I knew ran near the bottom of the hill. I remembered the contour of the land, the slope, the small stream that cut across the side trail. I aimed for it, hoping I could navigate by memory alone. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, I stumbled onto the logging road. The ground flattened, the trees thinned. And there it was, my car, exactly where I had left it, headlights off, untouched. My chest tightened with relief. I circled the car, checking the tires, the doors, the hood, but there was nothing. Not a sign of anyone else. No footprints except my own, no broken branches, nothing. Just my car, solid and ordinary in the dark. I sat inside for a long time, shaking, trying to process what had just happened. I replayed every sound, every movement, trying to convince myself it had all been adrenaline and imagination. But the footprints? I had seen them with my own eyes. They had been enormous, precise, circling me like some predator marking its territory. But when I returned to the car, there was nothing. No disturbance in the mud, no evidence beyond my own scattered footprints leading from the shortcut. I finally turned the key and drove slowly back toward the main road. Every few minutes, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting shadows to emerge from the treeline, half expecting to see someone following. But the forest stayed dark and still, ordinary in its quiet, as though nothing had happened at all. The next day, I returned to the shortcut in daylight. The overgrown path was even narrower, tangled with vines and fallen leaves. I could see why I had lost the trail in the dark. The path was hardly distinguishable from the rest of the forest floor, and any misstep would take you deep into thick underbrush. The mud where I had seen the enormous footprints had dried completely, showing only faint marks of my own boots from the previous night. There was no sign of anyone else. Nothing to explain the sounds, the shadows, or the circling prints. I've hiked alone many times before, but that night changed how I moved through the woods. I stick to marked trails now, and I carry extra batteries, a backup flashlight, and my phone fully charged. I've told myself 100 times that it was probably some hunter or a large man trudging through the mud, maybe trying to scare me. But even then, the timing, the silence, the way the footprints circled me, it's hard to reconcile with anything logical. I never went back to Devil's Glen after that. The woods looked the same in daylight, quiet, calm, almost beautiful, but I knew how different it could feel when the shadows start moving and there is no one else around. When the forest is silent in a way that isn't natural. That night, I learned that being alone in the woods, even in a familiar area, can make you doubt everything you think you know about your surroundings. And sometimes, the forest keeps its own secrets, leaving only traces that make you question whether you were ever really alone, or if you were just imagining the danger until you finally ran into something you could recognize, like your car. Even now, I remember the sound of the twig snapping, the low grunt behind me, and the way those enormous prints circled me in the mud. I can't explain it. I don't need to. What matters is that I got back. I got back to something familiar, something real. And that's enough. I've never doubted the woods in the same way again, and I never will. I set out late in the afternoon, backpack heavy with a full day's worth of supplies, aiming to complete a new 10-mile loop trail in the Allegheny National Forest that I hadn't tried before. The air was damp and earthy, carrying the smell of pine needles and decaying leaves. The sky had been a muted gray all day, and as I hiked deeper into the woods, the light thinned quickly, slipping through the canopy in streaks. I was careful with my footing, the trail winding over roots and slick moss-covered rocks. Everything felt normal, predictable even, until the sun dipped below the ridges and the shadows grew long, turning the woods into a lattice of dark and deeper dark. I had my headlamp packed, but I didn't expect to need it yet. The trail markings were subtle but consistent, painted in little white rectangles on trees that I passed one after another. I could hear the distant hum of a creek and occasional birds calling their final notes before night fully took over. By the time the last light disappeared, the forest was quiet in a way that seemed to press against my ears, amplifying every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves. I made a mental note to stay alert and check my GPS regularly, though the battery was already showing signs of strain. Around 2 in the morning, after hiking slower than usual because of the darkness, I realized something was off. I had followed a fork in the trail that I didn't remember seeing on my map, and as I stopped to check my GPS, I saw that my location was technically still on the trail, but nothing looked familiar. The faint white markers were gone, replaced by a tangle of trees that all looked the same. I tried to backtrack, but the soil was wet, the ground soft and uneven, and I kept tripping over roots that seemed to appear from nowhere. My boots squelched in the mud, and the smell of wet earth filled my nose, sharp and sour. Then I heard it. At first, I wasn't sure. It was soft, almost like a breeze through the leaves, a sound that didn't belong. It sounded like words, low and breathy, and it made the hairs on my neck stand on end. I froze. The sound was indistinct, just on the edge of comprehension, and it sounded like someone, or multiple someones, was whispering. I called out, my own voice breaking the tense silence, and the sound stopped abruptly. My heartbeat thumped in my chest, echoing in my ears. I told myself it was probably another hiker, maybe someone camping nearby, and tried to shake it off. I started moving again, picking a path that looked vaguely like the trail, my flashlight cutting through the thick darkness. The whispers returned, this time coming from all around me. I spun, shining the light through the trees, but I saw nothing. The forest looked the same in every direction, dark trunks, low branches, fallen leaves soaked in dew. My mind tried to make sense of it, and I told myself it was exhaustion or the wind catching in the trees. I kept telling myself that, but the whispering persisted, circling me, shifting, never quite letting me forget it was there. It was subtle, almost too soft to hear clearly, but I thought I could make out fragments like "Don't leave, stay with us." Panic started to rise, not sharp, but insistent, gnawing at my focus. I picked up my pace, my legs heavy and awkward with the pack, my lungs burning in the cold air. Every footstep seemed to echo, and every snap of a twig sounded amplified, like it was following me. My flashlight swept over the forest floor, revealing nothing but mud, leaves, and the occasional broken branch. Even so, the feeling that something was just beyond the reach of the light never went away. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself that the shadows were playing tricks, that the whispers were probably the wind in combination with my own tired mind. I kept checking my GPS, which stubbornly showed I was still following the trail, though the paths all looked identical and disorienting. Every turn seemed familiar yet different, as if the woods had subtly shifted while I wasn't looking. I considered stopping and resting, but a tight knot of fear in my stomach forced me forward. The whispers weren't loud, but they had a cadence that seemed to match my heartbeat, and the sense of being watched tightened around me like a cord. Eventually, I saw a glimmer of moving water through the trees and decided to follow it. Streams often led to roads or campsites, and I clung to that logic. My pace quickened, boots sliding in the mud, the scent of wet leaves and decaying wood growing stronger. I slipped once and fell hard, mud coating my pants and scraping my hands on rough bark. I caught myself and kept moving, shaking and sweating despite the cold night air. The whispers didn't follow the stream exactly but continued around me, teasing the edges of my perception, never close enough to locate, never far enough to ignore. I followed the stream for what felt like hours. The cold water sparkled faintly under my flashlight, and small frogs jumped with each step, startling me more than once. I started noticing other signs: overturned rocks, broken branches, and the occasional pile of flattened leaves that didn't match the natural forest floor. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it made my skin crawl. The forest behind me had become indistinct and threatening, yet ahead, the stream glimmered with promise. I clung to that vision like a lifeline. Finally, just as dawn began to tint the horizon a pale gray, I saw the shape of a small ranger station through the trees. Relief hit me like a wave, sudden and overwhelming. My legs trembled as I stumbled toward it, mud caked on my boots and soaking through my socks, my pack smelling faintly of wet earth, smoke, and decay from the forest floor I'd navigated. The door was locked, but a ranger arrived shortly after, drawn by the noise I must have made moving through the shallow undergrowth. I didn't explain much. I couldn't quite explain it. I just collapsed on the porch steps and tried to catch my breath. When I looked back toward the forest, it was calm. The sunlight was soft, filtering through the trees in golden streams, and the forest looked like any other morning, peaceful and undisturbed. Birds called from high branches, and the underbrush glimmered with dew. It was as if the night hadn't happened at all. But my boots were heavy with mud I hadn't stepped in intentionally, and my pack carried the lingering smell of wet earth and something faintly burned. I realized later that the whispers were probably my own mind, the brain's way of trying to make sense of isolation, exhaustion, and fear in the oppressive night forest. The loops in the trail, the identical trees, and the stream's erratic path had created a sensory trap, disorienting and real, and the smell of smoke and decay might have come from distant campfires or a fallen, smoldering branch. By mid-morning, I had collected myself, changed into dry socks, and made it back to the main road. I retraced my route with a clearer head, noting exactly where I had taken the wrong turn. I spent the next few weeks studying maps and trail markers in detail, making sure I would never make the same mistake again. The memory of the night stayed with me, not supernatural, just terrifyingly real in its isolation and my own mind's reaction to it. The forest itself hadn't changed. It was just the combination of darkness, fatigue, and disorientation that had made it feel alive in a way I hadn't expected. I never hiked that loop at night again, and I made it a rule to always hike with at least one other person when venturing deep into unfamiliar trails. The Allegheny National Forest remained beautiful and inviting in the daylight, but I understood something about it I hadn't before. The forest could be patient and silent, and in the wrong conditions, it could turn a simple mistake into a night that felt endless. That night, the only thing truly terrifying was how completely I had lost myself in a place I thought I knew. The memory of the whispers never returned in daylight, but the echo of fear stayed with me for years. I understood, finally, that the danger had never been anything outside myself. It had been the forest's quiet, the darkness, and my own mind trying to navigate the unknown. And that realization, calm and rational though it is, never fully erased the memory of mud on my boots, the smell of decay, or the feeling of being silently circled by something unseen. It had been entirely real and entirely my own. I woke in the middle of the night to a smell that didn't belong. It was faint at first, a wisp of smoke drifting into the tent, sharp and acrid, cutting through the scent of damp pine and my own sweat. I wasn't sure I was fully awake, that strange liminal state where everything feels wrong, but you can't quite place why. The tent walls were lit by the soft glow of the moon outside, silver and cold, spilling across the nylon in thin, uneven streaks. I rolled onto my side, trying to ignore it, but the smell didn't fade. My chest tightened. Smoke doesn't just appear in the middle of the night. Nobody had lit a fire. We hadn't even moved the lanterns inside the tents. I fumbled for my phone. The screen came on with a sharp glare, the harsh white light burning into my sleepy eyes. That's when I noticed the notification. Motion detected near Tent 3. My stomach dropped. Tent 3 was where the others were sleeping, completely unaware. I squinted at the screen, trying to make sense of the alert. My phone had no battery left, less than 10%. It was almost gone. I unzipped the tent slowly, making the minimal noise I could. Outside, the forest was quiet, almost aggressively still. No crickets, no wind rattling the branches, no distant water from the small stream that ran near our campsite. Just the smoke and the darkness. I clicked on my flashlight, the beam cutting a thin line through the black. That's when I saw it. A figure stood just beyond the ring of light, tall and thin, unnaturally still. It was hard to tell exactly what I was looking at first. My mind grasped for an explanation, a lost hiker, someone pranking us, but the posture, the way it held itself, made everything feel off. The shoulders were narrow but rigid, the head slightly tilted, and it didn't move a muscle. It simply stared. I froze where I stood, the flashlight trembling slightly in my hand. Then it raised a hand, slow, deliberate, almost like a signal. Not waving, not reaching for anything, just pointing. My throat closed up. I whispered the first warning I could think of to my friends, who didn't stir, buried under their sleeping bags, breathing steadily, oblivious. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I couldn't. I could feel my heartbeat in my ears, sharp and insistent, as if the forest itself was pressing against me. The figure stayed there for minutes, though I swear it couldn't have been more than a few seconds, the weight of it impossible to measure against time. I focused on the shape, trying to memorize every angle, every line, so that I could remember exactly what I had seen. And then, without warning, it was gone. Just slipped into the trees, leaving nothing but the faintest rustle of leaves. No sound of running, no snapping of twigs, just a presence that disappeared. I waited for a long time, flashlight sweeping back and forth, every nerve taut, until the night swallowed it entirely. Morning came gray and damp, the clouds low over the peaks of Mount Hood, muffling the light. I didn't sleep. I stayed awake in the tent, listening to the others breathe, my mind replaying every detail. The smell of smoke had vanished with the night, leaving only the earthy scent of wet soil and fallen needles. We emerged from the tents mid-morning, stretching and shaking off the stiffness of a night spent on uneven ground. That's when I noticed the footprints. They were large, far too large to be human in any conventional sense. Wide, deep impressions in the muddy ground, circling the campsite in a rough, uneven ring. The mud was soft from last night's rain, giving the impressions a clarity I couldn't ignore. The footprints led from the treeline to our tents and back, not following any clear path or direction, but always returning to the center, as if the watcher had been pacing, observing. My friends laughed at them, joking about bears or some local prankster. I couldn't laugh. There was a precision to the prints, the way they avoided some trees and landed near others, that suggested careful, deliberate movement. And the scale of them, the sheer width, made my stomach knot. I tried to shove the thought away, telling myself that my mind was playing tricks, that the shadows of the night had created a story where there was none. Packing up the campsite, I kept my eyes on the edge of the trees, scanning every shadow, every rustle. The hike back to the parking area was slow, my senses sharpened by the memory of the figure. Every branch snapping underfoot sounded like a warning, every bird call a signal. By the time we reached the car, the air was colder, the clouds heavier. I climbed in first, glancing around one last time before starting the engine. That's when I saw it. In the reflection of the side mirror, just a few yards behind the car, the figure stood again. Tall, thin, perfectly still, watching. My hand froze on the key. My stomach churned. I could see the outline of the body, the way the head tilted slightly, and the hand, now lowered but still distinct against the darkness. I started the engine slowly, the rumble of the car filling the air, the only sound for miles around. The figure didn't move, didn't flinch. It stayed there until the car rolled forward, leaves crunching under the tires, until the mirror caught only trees again, nothing more. The drive down the winding road from Mount Hood was tense, my eyes flicking between the road and the rearview mirror. I tried to rationalize what I had seen. A hiker? Impossible. No one could have moved that silently, that deliberately, through the wet underbrush. A lost camper? Maybe, but why stay still, why point, why vanish without a sound? Every explanation felt inadequate. By the time we reached the highway, the sun had broken through the clouds, casting bright strips of light across the asphalt. The tension in my body eased slightly, though the image remained. The height, the thinness, the impossibly still stance. My friends talked about breakfast, about the drive back into town, oblivious to the figure I had seen twice in one night. I stayed quiet, staring out the window, trying to commit the roads, the trees, the angles of the forest to memory. When we finally stopped for gas, I stepped out and looked back toward the highway leading into the forest. Nothing. The mist had lifted, and the trees were just trees, ordinary and unmoving. The figure was gone, like it had never existed, and yet I knew it had. I could still feel the weight of its stare, the deliberate, almost sentient calm. I told myself that the prints could have been from something else, something explainable. But the figure, the way it had appeared, the way it had pointed, there was no rational explanation that fit. I didn't feel fear in the way you read about in stories, but an acute awareness, a careful, measured anxiety that stayed with me long after we left the forest. Even now, months later, when I drive past forests or think about Mount Hood, I remember the smoke, the motion alert, the silent figure standing in the night. I know it wasn't supernatural. It wasn't a ghost or a monster. It was a person, or something that moved with intention, intelligence, and the ability to remain unseen until it chose not to be. I never found out who, or what, was watching our campsite. The prints had washed away with the next rain. My friends have long since forgotten the incident, laughed it off as imagination, campfires, or foggy memories. But I know what I saw, and I know that in the deep forests there are people, or something like people, that can move silently, watch, and vanish without leaving a trace. And I know whenever I drive past the edge of a dark forest, I look in the mirror just in case. I had driven out to the maple grove near Bayfield on a clear, crisp night, the kind where the air smells faintly of wet earth and cold leaves, and every breath feels sharp in your lungs. I was carrying my camera gear, a tripod, and a small backpack with extra batteries, thinking I would get a few night shots of the full moon rising between the bare branches. The grove is a quiet place, mostly abandoned by people at this time of year, and I like it because it feels removed from everything else, the kind of silence that isn't quite empty but full of small, ordinary sounds you don't usually notice. My tires crunched over the frost-hardened dirt road as I parked near the edge of the trees, and I unloaded slowly, trying not to disturb anything in the underbrush. The moon was high and bright, casting long, sharp shadows between the rows of maples. I set up my tripod, adjusted the camera, and started taking shots, letting the cold settle into my fingers. My breath formed small clouds in the light, and each shutter click felt loud against the stillness. The forest smelled faintly sweet and damp, the kind of smell that sticks to your boots and jeans. I moved slowly, framing shots of the twisted branches and the pale moonlight filtering through them. My flashlight hung from a strap on my shoulder, off for now, since I wanted to preserve the natural light in the images. After a while, maybe 30 minutes, I noticed something strange. At first, I thought it was a trick of the camera or a glint on a wet branch, but when I looked up, there were tiny reflections in the darkness, scattered low to the ground. They weren't moving like fireflies, and they were too bright to be moonlight bouncing off leaves. I froze for a moment, trying to convince myself it was just a puddle reflecting the sky, or some distant road light caught in the tree trunks. Then, I realized the lights were arranged in a way that didn't make sense for reflections. They were all at about the same height, not scattered across branches or leaves, and they seemed to form rough shapes, like small mounds or silhouettes. I lifted my flashlight slowly and swept it across the grove. The reflections didn't vanish. They glinted back at me, sharp and deliberate. My stomach tightened. I could now see dozens of small points of light, low to the ground, staring at me from between the tree trunks. I couldn't tell what they were. My first thought was deer or foxes, but I've spent enough nights in this grove to know how their eyes reflect. This was different. The reflections weren't horizontal like a deer's. They were tiny, round, and unnervingly still. They didn't blink or shift. They just watched. I took a small step backward, then another, trying to keep my movements slow. My heart was beating hard in my chest, echoing in my ears, and the cold air seemed to make the silence louder. The forest had changed. Before, it had felt safe, a place I could wander and focus on light and shadow. Now it felt like I was intruding, like every branch and leaf could hide something watching me. The eyes stayed fixed, following me as I retreated, and I could feel them in the corner of my vision, even when I didn't look directly at them. I tried not to make sudden movements, to avoid provoking whatever it was. Every snap of a twig under my boots felt like a shout in the quiet. The moonlight helped just enough to see the ground, but it also exaggerated the shadows between the trees. Each time I glanced at the reflective points, I felt a jolt of panic. They weren't clustered like a normal animal group. They were scattered, as if placed deliberately in the spaces between trees, and the more I moved, the more I realized I didn't want to turn my back completely. I angled my flashlight occasionally, scanning, but the beams didn't show bodies or shapes clearly. Just the points of reflection, sharp and bright, staring. I could feel a cold sweat on my neck, though the air was frosty. I kept backing toward the edge of the grove, my legs stiff and my breathing shallow. Every time I paused, the eyes seemed closer, or maybe I was just imagining it. I couldn't hear footsteps, growls, or rustling, nothing except my own boots and the faint wind in the branches. I told myself repeatedly that it was probably deer or foxes or maybe raccoons. Bayfield is rural, and wildlife is normal here. But I have taken night photos in this grove many times before, and I know how deer's eyes glow. This wasn't it. This was too consistent, too intentional, as if someone, or something, was choosing to stay just out of reach, watching. I finally reached the edge of the woods, where the maples thin and the small farm roads and fields start. I stopped, looking back. The points of light were gone. The sense of being watched faded almost instantly. My hands shook so badly that I had to set the camera down on the frozen grass. I stayed there for a long time, breathing heavily, ears straining for any hint of movement in the grove. Nothing came, just the faint rustle of the wind through the tall grass and the occasional distant call of a night bird. I forced myself to think rationally, to calm down. Maybe it had been a group of hunters sitting low in the trees, or someone testing a reflective material, maybe children with flashlights playing a prank. It had to be something human or animal, because this is real life, not the stories people tell to scare themselves. I packed up quickly, keeping my flashlight on, scanning the woods as I walked back to my car. Every shadow felt like it might conceal movement, and every rustle of leaves made me flinch. When I finally reached the dirt road and could see the small lights of Bayfield in the distance, I slowed, allowing my heartbeat to return to normal. I told myself again it was deer, foxes, or a prank. That was the only way to make sense of it, because nothing else in that grove could explain dozens of still, reflective points of light low to the ground, arranged almost geometrically, without moving. Deer don't sit still in that formation, and foxes never keep their eyes perfectly aligned. Back in my car, I drove slowly, watching the tree line recede in my mirrors. I kept thinking about the eyes, and how they had followed me without moving, without a sound. I checked my camera briefly, half expecting some reflection of shapes or bodies in the shots, but the images showed nothing unusual. Just the moon, the trees, and shadows. Maybe I hadn't seen what I thought I did. Maybe it had been a trick of the light, or fatigue. But even now, weeks later, I remember how precise and deliberate the reflections had been. I haven't gone back to that grove at night. I still take my moon photos during dusk or early evening, when the light is fading but the world is still visible, because I don't need to test the edges of that grove again. The forest felt ordinary, then suddenly extraordinary, and I realized how quickly something familiar can become unfamiliar when it's dark and quiet and you're alone. I still can't explain exactly what I saw. Deer, foxes, or children with flashlights could account for it, but I have a hard time believing any of those explanations fully. What I do know is that I felt watched, and that feeling stayed with me long after I left. The grove is beautiful in daylight, ordinary in the way forests usually are, but at midnight, with the moon high and the wind still, it can make you doubt what you thought you knew about your surroundings. That night, I learned that sometimes you can see something real, something ordinary, and it can still terrify you. And sometimes the truth doesn't matter as much as the way it makes you feel. I had rented a small cabin near Silver Creek for a few days to get away from everything. The kind of place where the road narrows to dirt and gravel, and the last stretch winds through thick forest, the trees leaning close over the car like they were whispering to each other. It was late September, early enough in the fall that the leaves had started to turn but not yet fallen completely, so the woods were full of oranges and reds, a noisy crunch under every footstep. I arrived late afternoon, the sun already leaning low behind the hills, casting the creek water in streaks of gold. The cabin was modest, wooden, with a small porch and one single window that looked out over the creek. Inside, it smelled faintly of pine and old carpet, but it was clean. I unpacked, made a small fire, and tried to settle in, feeling that usual mix of excitement and isolation that comes with being completely alone in the woods. I ate a simple dinner, then cleaned up and made sure the fire was out. The cabin had no internet and spotty cell service, which was part of the appeal. The light outside dimmed quickly, and by the time I went to bed, the darkness pressed against the windows like a physical weight. I double-checked that the doors were locked and turned on a small lamp. The silence was deep, the kind that feels alive. I could hear the creek faintly, and occasionally the distant snap of a branch underfoot, probably a deer or a raccoon. Sometime around 1 a.m., I woke to a sound. A soft tapping. My first thought was a branch hitting the window from a breeze. I stayed still for a moment, listening. Then it came again, a little louder, deliberate, not random like wind or rain. My pulse picked up. I rolled out of bed quietly and grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand. The cabin felt smaller than I remembered, the shadows heavier in the corners. I shined the light outside the window. Nothing. The porch was empty. No branches hanging close enough to make a sound like that, no animals, just the faint shimmer of the creek. I forced myself to breathe normally and went to check the door. The lock was fine, but then I saw them, muddy footprints on the porch. Large, heavy, wet, and fresh. They led from the edge of the porch toward the cabin door, but stopped there. My stomach dropped. I checked every door and window, making sure they were locked. Every lock was fine, every bolt in place, but the footprints were unmistakable. Someone or something had been there. My hands shook slightly, and I stayed awake for the rest of the night, flashlight in hand, circling the cabin, checking every shadow, listening for anything. Every sound made me flinch, a twig breaking in the woods, the creek shifting over rocks, a bird settling in for the night. The tapping never returned, but I didn't sleep. At first light, I finally stepped outside. The morning air was crisp, cold enough that my breath steamed. The porch was still wet with dew, but now I could see deeper into the woods. There were scratches on the side of the cabin, almost claw-like, gouged into the wood siding near the window. They were deep, uneven, jagged, and ran from halfway up the wall down toward the ground. My stomach sank further. Whoever, or whatever, had left the footprints and scratches was strong, deliberate, and had been close enough to the cabin to study it. I followed the footprints from the porch down the steps and toward the tree line. They led into the woods and vanished after a few dozen feet, pressed into the soft soil, disappearing where the undergrowth thickened. I walked along the edge of the trees, looking for any sign of someone hiding, any discarded gear, anything that explained it, but there was nothing. No tracks returning to the road, no other footprints nearby, no indication that anyone had come up the dirt road at all. It was a remote place. The road was rarely used, and at that hour, I was certain nobody could have arrived without being heard. The more I looked, the less sense it made. The scratches on the cabin looked like the work of someone trying to force their way in, but every door and window was intact. The prints looked like someone had been careful, maybe reckless, but not enough to leave a clear trail of approach or retreat beyond the initial marks. I started to piece it together in my head, trying to keep calm. It had to be a person, probably someone wandering through the woods, or someone familiar with the area. Maybe a hunter, or someone camping nearby. But the scratches were deliberate, almost angry, and the footprints were too large for any local teenager I could imagine. I felt exposed, vulnerable, and angry with myself for being careless enough to stay alone in a place like this. I packed quickly, checking the cabin one last time for anything I might have missed. I grabbed my bag, making sure nothing was left behind that could be stolen, and double-checked the doors as I left. The drive back to the main road was tense. Every crack of a branch, every rustle in the brush made me tense my hands on the steering wheel. I didn't slow down for scenic views. I kept my eyes on the road, listening to the engine, counting every shadow. By the time I reached pavement, I still felt the unease clinging to me, that sense of being watched that didn't fade immediately. When I finally stopped at a gas station, I sat in the car for a long time, letting the sun fully rise, letting the world feel safe again. I never returned to that cabin, and I didn't tell anyone exactly what had happened for weeks. When I did, people dismissed it as a weird coincidence or a trick of imagination, but I knew what I had seen. The prints, the scratches, the deliberate tapping, all of it was real, tangible, and unexplainable in the context of a quiet, empty woods at night. I thought about the person who might have been out there, or if it was just some local who liked to wander. Either way, the way they had observed the cabin, the care they had taken to make contact without breaking in, stuck with me. Now, when I go camping or rent a remote cabin, I make sure I'm not the only person for miles around. I double-check locks and carry a flashlight close at hand. I avoid the temptation of complete solitude, because I know what it's like to hear tapping on a window in the dead of night, to see footprints that don't belong, and to realize that, even in the quietest, most beautiful woods, someone else can be watching you without ever revealing themselves. The memory of that night near Silver Creek is still vivid, and it changed the way I think about isolation in the woods forever. I learned that even places that feel completely safe can hold a stranger in the shadows, and that sometimes the most terrifying thing is simply knowing someone was there, watching, and could come back if they wanted. I never found out who, or what, had been on that porch, and I never want to. The scratches and prints were gone the next season, washed away by rain and snow, but the memory stayed with me. I left the cabin behind, but the sense of awareness, of never truly being alone in the forest, remained. That night taught me to respect the silence and the shadows, and to trust my instincts when something feels wrong. It wasn't supernatural. It wasn't imagined. It was just real, human, and enough to make me never stay alone in a remote cabin again. I started my hike near Estes Park on a cool October morning, the kind where the air carries the faint smell of damp earth and pine, and the clouds sit low over the mountains, heavy and gray. The sun had been struggling to push through the haze all day, and by mid-afternoon it had already begun its slow slide toward the horizon. I had chosen a ridge trail that I hadn't explored before, a narrow, uneven path lined with loose rocks and dry pine needles, and I was carrying only a small pack with water, a snack, and a flashlight tucked in an outside pocket, thinking I would be back well before dark. The hike itself had been quiet in the way the high country tends to be quiet this time of year. Birds called occasionally, distant and fleeting, and the wind whispered through the trees, brushing against my face and neck, sometimes strong enough to make me adjust my footing. I kept a steady pace, enjoying the way the ridge opened up below me with sweeping views of the valley, the river threading silver through the patches of forest, and the mountains beyond fading into the mist. By the time I reached a small outcropping about halfway up the ridge, I was breathing heavier than usual. I paused, leaning against a jagged boulder and letting the air fill my lungs, letting my eyes wander over the rocky slope above me. The clouds were thickening, turning everything into muted shades of gray and green, and the temperature had dropped noticeably, cutting through my light fleece. I noticed how the light was fading faster than I had expected, how the shadows of the pines stretched long and dark over the ridge. And that's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a rock formation, the shape of a large, crouched figure outlined against the lighter gray of the clouds. But as I focused, I realized it wasn't a rock at all. It was a silhouette, completely black, crouched on the ridge above me. It didn't shift in the wind. It didn't blend in or flicker like a tree trunk or a boulder might. It was still, completely still. My first instinct was to call out, though I knew I hadn't heard another hiker all day, and I didn't really want anyone else around just then. My heart picked up speed, but I reminded myself to breathe. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe someone was hunting, maybe it was a photographer hiding for wildlife, but nothing fit. I had a clear line of sight, and it was watching me. I shifted slightly, moving a foot to adjust my position on the uneven rocks, and the figure mirrored me. My stomach dropped. I froze again, and it froze as if it had stopped moving at the exact same time. I crouched to check the ground, maybe to grab something from my pack, and the figure crouched, perfectly matching my movements. My mind raced. It had to be coincidence. There's no way someone could anticipate every small motion I made, right? And yet, there it was. Every move I made, it copied. I backed up slowly, keeping my eyes on it, trying not to turn my back, trying to remind myself that the ridge above me was exposed, uneven, and treacherous. If someone had been sitting there for any length of time, they would have slipped on the rocks or left a mark, but the slope looked untouched. No footprints, no disturbed stones, no signs of anything human. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, maybe a large black bear, though bears don't mirror movements like that. And they don't stay completely still, perfectly balanced on a narrow ridge. I moved in small steps, testing the slope below me, finding solid spots to place my feet. Each time I glanced up, it was there, crouched, following my movements with unnerving precision. My stomach tightened with every step, a cold pressure that made it hard to breathe steadily. The ridge felt narrower, steeper, as if the air around me had thickened and the clouds had pressed closer. The wind picked up, whistling through the rocks and pines, but the figure didn't shift with the gusts. It didn't even flinch. I told myself I was imagining it, that the low light, the shifting shadows, the clouds, everything was playing tricks on my eyes. I slowed my breathing, trying to measure the space between the figure and me, calculating angles, thinking maybe I could slip past without it noticing. But no matter how careful I was, it mirrored me. When I crouched behind a small outcrop to shield myself, the black shape crouched at the same time. When I leaned slightly to peer around a boulder, the figure leaned. My mind started running through worst-case scenarios, which I hate admitting even now. Was it a person? Was it some kind of survivalist, watching hikers for sport? I tried to recall every story I'd ever heard about attacks in the backcountry. Nothing fit perfectly. And yet, the sensation of being watched, being matched in real time, left me with a primal, crawling fear. Not the fear of a bear or a snake, but of someone or something that was fully aware of me, tracking every motion. I moved carefully, slowly, toward the point where the ridge dropped to a wider, safer trail that would eventually lead back to the main path, and, eventually, my car. I didn't dare run. Anything that fast and jerky might trigger some response I couldn't predict. I kept my hands free, ready to throw something or grab a stick if necessary. Every step was deliberate, every movement calculated, and every glance up at the ridge confirmed the figure was still there. Still mirroring me. Still crouched, still waiting. The last stretch to the trailhead felt endless. My legs were sore, my shoulders tight from holding the pack and bracing against the cold wind, but the fear kept me moving steadily. When I finally reached the point where I could see the curve of the road leading down to the parking area, I took a deep breath, weighing the distance. Slowly, almost hesitantly, I turned toward my car and broke into a brisk walk. I didn't run, not yet, but I kept my eyes on the ridge, ready to react. And then I stopped. The ridge was empty. No black figure crouched there. No shadows that moved with me. No signs that anyone had been up there at all. Rocks were undisturbed. Needles and small stones lay as if no one had passed. I froze for a long moment, blinking in disbelief, scanning the ridge, making sure my eyes weren't deceiving me. Nothing. The walk to my car felt surreal, like I was moving through a world where time and perception had slipped. When I reached the vehicle, I locked the doors behind me without touching anything else, and sat in the driver's seat, heart pounding, the interior lights casting a pale glow over the dashboard. I kept glancing up at the ridge through the windshield, half expecting to see the figure materialize on a rock, crouched, waiting. But there was nothing. I drove slowly down the narrow mountain road, hands gripping the wheel, mind replaying every detail. The way it had mirrored me so perfectly, the way it had remained completely still even as the wind gusted around it, the way it had disappeared without leaving a trace. Rationally, I tried to come up with explanations. Maybe a hiker in dark clothing who had been lying in the shadows, waiting for someone to pass. Maybe an experienced hunter blending into the terrain. Maybe my eyes had tricked me, the interplay of light and shadow exaggerating shapes and movement. Even with those possibilities, the memory stayed with me. I kept seeing it crouched there, matching my every move, like it had been watching me for longer than I wanted to imagine. My logical mind fought the fear, reminding me there was nothing supernatural, nothing inexplicable beyond human presence and human observation. But still, I felt a tightness in my chest, a creeping awareness that someone had been there, and that they had known exactly what I would do next. Once I reached the main road and the familiar grid of streets leading into Estes Park, the fear began to ease. Streetlights, passing cars, the sound of tires on pavement, familiarity replaced the primal tension of the ridge. I parked at a small trailhead I knew, stepped out, and let the warm glow of a nearby gas station wash over me. The ridge was behind me, the sun long gone, clouds thickening over the peaks, but I felt relief in the concrete, in the human-made lights and structures. I never saw the figure again, never found footprints or disturbed ground, and I don't know if it had been a person or something else entirely. What I do know is that experience left an imprint. Walking along ridges now, I keep my head on a swivel, my senses alert to motion and shadow. I trust my instincts more than I did that day. I trust the quiet feeling of being watched. And I know that, for a few minutes on that October ridge, something had been there, mirroring me and waiting, aware in a way that was frighteningly precise. I haven't returned to that ridge. I don't need to. The memory is clear enough, and the lesson permanent. Sometimes the wilderness isn't empty, and sometimes the most unnerving presence is the one that matches you step for step without making a sound.